So we've got samadhi, we've got shamatha. You've been talking about jhana or dhyana in Sanskrit.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship between shamatha and jhana.
Sure. And so, again, I'd like to go to the gold standard, because I have looked fairly carefully in the Pali literature, the Theravada commentaries, for which I have tremendous respect. Also looked in the Mahayana literature on the jhanas and shamatha, the access and so forth. And I did my doctoral dissertation on this, so I was familiar with it and drenched my mind in it academically for a number of years at Stanford. And I don't see any significant differences. That is, differences in fundamental view or evaluation. What is the first jhana, the second, the third, fourth, all within the form realm. Or then beyond that, there are the samapatis, the absorptions in the formless realm. I've read the literature, and I find a tremendous complementarity in some places. They don't say exactly the same thing, but a congruity, a harmony. So I just don't see any grounds for any interesting debate, but rather learning from. So I have learned a great deal from my very esteemed Theravada friends, Bhikkhu Bodhi, Analayo Bhikkhu, and others who have such knowledge of this tradition, far more than myself. I learn from them. And so simply put, there's a gold standard here for which I don't see any serious debate. And that is when you've fully achieved the first jhana, the whole locus of your awareness has moved from this familiar world here that we call the desire realm, the kamadhatu in Buddhism. It's our familiar world where there's so many things out there that we tend to desire or desire to be free of, right? Looking outwardsly. So we're dwelling in a realm of existence, a dimension of existence, where happiness seems to be out there, and we scurry around in motion, looking for places, situations, people, jobs, automobiles, and so forth that will give us happiness. When you cross the threshold from the desire realm into the form realm, that point of transition, crossing the threshold, is exactly the point at which you fully achieve shamatha. But then when you not only are on the threshold, it's like being at the doormat of a house.
Yeah.
And with one foot inside the house. Are you in the house? Yes. Are you fully in the house? Well, no, but you have crossed the threshold, right? That's the achievement of shamatha. Now, you may enter fully into the house where your awareness is fully absorbed in this first jhana, and there are multiple mansions, so to speak, or dimensions within this form realm, which is another dimension of reality. It's more Platonic in nature, a realm of pure ideas, pure forms. And so Buddhaghosa, who I think it's safe to say is the most authoritative commentator in the entire Theravada tradition. He is the gold standard. We don't have to agree with everything he says, but his authority is spanning for 1,500 years by now. And I have tremendous respect for his writings. Just absolutely brilliant. He says, when you have fully, I'm paraphrasing here, but I have the direct quote in my notes. He says, when you fully achieve the first jhana, then one who has achieved that can remain in samadhi in a stretch, in a flow of samadhi. Flawless. No excitation, no laxity, no hyperactivity, no deficit, just a flow, effortless flow of samadhi for 24 hours straight. And he said it's like a strong man who can remain standing for 24 hours at a stretch. Now, that's very plain English. Yeah. That is the gold standard. Now, right next to that gold standard for the full achievement of the first jhana is access to, or the threshold to the first jhana. That, as I've mentioned before, is what we equate with shamatha in all schools of Tibetan Buddhism. And of course, that's rooted in Indian Mahayana Buddhism. And here, once again, there's just no debate that I've ever heard. If you've achieved not the full jhana, but access to the first jhana, you can remain in that same flow of awareness where the entire current of your awareness is withdrawn from all the five physical senses. It's all drawn into purely mental. You're able to remain in that flow, just impeccable. Continuous, free of excitation, free of all five hindrances or five obscurations, which I'll go into later perhaps, for 4 hours minimum.
4 hours.
4 hours. So not as stable as the full achievement, but in both cases you're equally free of these five obscurations.
Buddhaghosa describes it as a toddler walking butt. So do we agree with that?
Well, the toddler, that's a related point and very interesting one. Because you achieve, now we're going into some real nitty-gritty areas. I adore this material.
We are at Harvard, we can geek out a little bit.
I've been practicing teaching it for 40 years now, and I just kind of I feel like a school kid. I love it so much. It's so interesting. So, you can't fake this. I mean, I just love this material. So the toddler, let's go to the toddler. So he tells with great precision what's it like, for example, by way of mindfulness breathing, which is the most commonly practiced shamatha method in the Theravada tradition. He tells when the so-called counterpart sign arises. You've crossed the threshold, because the origin of this counterpart sign, I won't go into it right now for the sake of brevity, emerges from the form realm. It's not something conjured up by your mind in
So
the
the
desire
nimitta
realm.
is from the
The
form
nimitta,
realm.
the counterpart nimitta, is emerging from the form realm. But he said it's 100 and 1,000 times more subtle than the so-called acquired sign, which is a product of your mind in the desire realm. It's so subtle that you encounter it, but it's so subtle, it's very, very difficult to sustain that engagement with this extremely subtle sign, which a person in the desire realm can't even imagine it. You can use words, but you can't really nail it. And so this is the toddler, that you have achieved access to the first jhana. You've now, in our terminology, you've achieved shamatha. You've accessed that counterpart sign. You've crossed the threshold into the form realm. But it's so subtle that he says it's like a little toddler who gets up on his wobbly little legs and then falls back on his bum. And what he's referring to here is you are having a direct encounter, like by looking at your face, a direct encounter with this counterpart sign, but it's so elusive, so subtle, that you can't hold it. And you fall back into what he calls the bhavanga. And I translate the bhavanga as ground of becoming. Bhava means to become. Anga has various meanings, but one of them is basis or foundation. So I think ground of becoming is, I think, quite an illuminating translation. And this is where you just settle back into, you've not become dull. You should have gotten rid of that a long time ago. That's one of the 5 hindrances. You've not become dull, but you no longer have a clear target or object of your attention. So you slip back into this mode of awareness that has no clear referent, but it's bright, it's clear, it's sharp and discerning, but no object. So it is like, in fact, you slip into this bhavanga when you go into dreamless sleep, very deep dreamless sleep, stage 4 non-REM sleep. You slip into that, but unless you're lucid, you slip into it and your awareness is obscured by the dullness of deep sleep, so you don't even know you're deep asleep. But you're accessing the same dimension of consciousness. When you go into deep dreamless sleep, when you faint, you'll go comatose, and in the last moment of the dying process, you slip into that dimension. The difference is that most people, when we slip into deep dreamless sleep, we have no explicit awareness of anything, including the most obvious reality that we're deep asleep. Likewise, when you have general anesthesia, you faint, you go comatose, or in the final moment in the dying process, where you slip into, in Tibetan Buddhist terminology, the dark near attainment, you've just slipped into that dimension of consciousness. And most people, when they get there, they blank out. They blank out, like getting hit on the head and just passing out. But the key of the shamatha is you access that same dimension of consciousness, but you do so clearly, luminously, discerningly. You are lucid in that state. So it's analogous to being in lucid, dreamless sleep. But if you just are in a lucid dream, I don't want to go on too long here, but if you're in a lucid dream, and then you simply release the dream implodes, but you maintain lucidity, then you will go from a lucid dreaming state to a lucid dreamless state. This is like entering into the bhavanga with a 40-watt bulb. If you access that same bhavanga after probably thousands of hours of training, we're not talking a weekend here, we're not talking about a 1-month retreat, we're talking about a retreat, full-time practice, absolutely dedicated practice, to cultivating the attention skills, achieving shamatha, which will be a matter of months almost certainly, it could be years, but when you achieve it, then you're accessing that same dimension of consciousness, but with a 1,000-watt bulb. And so your awareness is radiantly clear, but when you're resting in the bhavanga, it's radiantly clear of nothing much.